of all of the things that you know, victims and survivors have been through, I think one of the hardest ones for everybody is victim blaming. Is that experience of telling somebody what happened, and then that response that you get that's sort of like, you should have known, or why didn't you do something different, or it's because you behaved like this, it's because you look like that, it's because you didn't do this, it's because you make bad choices, it's because you took risks, whatever it is, okay? And you know, it's a horrible thing to be on the receiving end of, because, you know, you've made that big step, that choice to either disclose to someone or report it somewhere, and then their response has been to attack you. And it stays with you. Lots of people who have been subjected to victim blaming will remember exactly what people said to them. They'll remember exactly where they were when they said it. They will remember how it made them feel. And for a lot of people who are blamed by police, by family members, by their friends, by their partners, they don't disclose again, or they decide they'll never report again, which I have no problem with. You know, I feel like if you've been through something like that and then you've had a really negative reaction that's blamed you for it, why should you keep talking about it? Why should you then trust those people again? Because there's a saying, isn't there, that says, you know, when somebody reveals themselves to you, believe them. And that's absolutely right. You know, if you put somebody in a situation where they need to give you an authentic response, and their response is, well, you know, what were you wearing, or you could have done something differently, or why didn't you tell someone sooner, they're revealing who they are to you. They're revealing a part of themselves that they don't believe survivors of sexual violence or of domestic violence, and that their issue sits with you and not with the perpetrator. And so once you've had that like message from someone, it makes total sense to then not trust them after that, or to decide that you're just never going to speak to them about that issue ever again. Victim blaming, you can watch lots of my videos on victim blaming. I'm not going to get into the theory and stuff right now, but you know, victim blaming happens for lots of different reasons, and some of that is, you know, denial of personal vulnerability, that if they can blame you, then they can convince themselves it'll never happen to them. So if they say, oh well, the reason it happened to you is because you walked home that way, or the reason it happened to you is because, you know, you're quite flirty and, you know, you hug people and you give off the wrong message, or whatever it is that they say, what they're actually saying to you is, I would never do that. So it's actually about self-preservation. They're convincing themselves that they wouldn't make the same mistakes as a victim, and therefore it'll never happen to them, or it'll never happen to them again. Because even victims will victim blame other victims. That's quite common. So some of it can be about that denial of personal vulnerability. It makes them feel safer by attacking you, which is horrible. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't justify it, but it explains it to some extent. And then you've got the type of victim blaming that is about this like belief that only bad things happen to bad people. So if something bad happened to a victim, they must have deserved it in one way or another. They must have done something wrong, or they have to change something about themselves. And you know, that is a horrible place to be for you. It is up against someone who believes that the only reason it happened to you is because you must have done something bad, or you've done something in a past life, or you're being punished for other things that you've done bad in your life. It's a horrible place to be, for someone to say those things to you about being raped, being abused, being exploited, being harmed by somebody. But there's lots of reasons why people victim blame. There's, you know, sort of a good sort of 6 or 7 decent psychological theories of victim blaming. But it doesn't matter if I just sat here and talked about them all, because it doesn't change the way it made you feel. And victim blaming can really mess with your head. Like, you can walk into that conversation quite confident that that wasn't your fault, and you can leave questioning everything about your life. That's quite common for people who go to the police. So if you go to the police and report a rape, or you report child abuse, or whatever it was that happened, and you walk in there thinking, I'm going to tell them everything, I'm going to tell them what happened to me, I'm going to tell the truth, and they're going to help me. And a lot of people in that situation actually don't get that experience. They'll then get questioned about themselves, their mental health, what they were wearing, who their friends are, you know, what they said, what they did they lead them on, why didn't you tell someone sooner? And you can come out of those interviews absolutely exhausted, but also questioning yourself, like, why didn't I tell someone sooner? Was it because of what I looked like? Is it because I'm from that area? You know, what did I do wrong to deserve this? Could I have done something better? Why didn't I figure out that it was happening sooner? So you can come out of conversations with all sorts of people feeling like that if they have blamed you, or even if they've implied blame. And so the other part of this is self-blame, because even if you've not been directly blamed by someone, because like there's going to be people that, you know, I'm talking to right now who've never told anybody what happened to them, but you still blame yourself. And that's because self-blame can happen without victim blaming. You can already blame yourself because of the way we've been socialized without somebody directly saying to you it was something you did. So with self-blame, there are also lots of purposes to self-blame. And these are very interesting actually, because it might change the way you see your self-blame. So some people blame themselves because it gives them a feeling of control. So for example, if I said, the reason it happened to me was because I was always going out drinking and knocking about with like lads. Okay, so let's say I said that. So in future, I'm going to stop knocking about with those lads and I'm going to stop drinking, because those are the things that led to me being abused or whatever happened. Now that makes sense, kind of. You might think, yeah, she's protecting herself, she's going to do something differently. But in reality, it wasn't me being friends with those people, or it wasn't me drinking that caused the sexual offences. It was the sex offender that caused the sexual offences. But what self-blame does in that way is it convinces you that you've found the reason why it happened and you can stop it from happening to you again. So you can blame things about yourself. So you might say, the reason it happened to me was because I didn't understand domestic violence. And I had no education on it, and I didn't understand the grooming process. So now I do know it won't happen to me again. But we can't categorically say that, because it wasn't your fault that it happened. The reason that somebody chose to abuse you was not because you weren't educated on domestic violence. It was because they wanted to. This is an issue that sits with them, not with you. So self-blame has all these different purposes. We also self-blame as a punishment. You know, like we feel like we allowed it to happen, or that we let it happen, or we wanted it to happen, or that we stayed in a situation that we couldn't get out of. And so we can sometimes get angry with ourselves, or we can be really disappointed in ourselves. We can feel shame, we can feel guilt, and then we start to blame ourselves for those reactions and for why we didn't do something different. We can blame ourselves for our reactions during the abuse, after the abuse, you know, how long it took us to report, or the fact that we've never reported. I've worked with usually, not always, but usually women and girls who blame themselves for their attacker then abusing somebody else. So for example, feeling like, if I'd have told somebody, then maybe that other girl after me wouldn't have been attacked. And that's not something you can hold. That's not your responsibility. It was never your fault. The fact that that abuser has multiple victims is their problem, and it is their choice to harm other humans. It's not something you could have protected other victims from. So self-blame can have these huge impacts on us, where we carry blame for things that happened to us, that were done to us, that were done to other people. We also can blame ourselves for the impact of disclosing the abuse. So sometimes we've disclosed the abuse to the family, and then it's had this huge fallout where everybody's argued, or this person's never spoken to us again, or this part of the family now doesn't talk to anybody. And you know, we blame ourselves, or we can be blamed for those impacts. You know, if you hadn't have said anything, none of this would have ever happened, type thing. And the impact also of self-blame tends to be that we will change something about ourselves to convince ourselves like that we can now protect ourselves from sexual violence and from domestic violence. So I worked with a woman who said that she was told by a psychologist that the reason that she was raped was because she was a professional dancer in the ballet, and because she was tall, she was beautiful, and she was blonde with long hair. And the psychologist said to her, you know, what did you expect to happen? You look like this, you do this type of job, that's why you were raped. And so, you know, that psychologist was wrong, categorically wrong. And they blamed her. That's what happened in that session. That psychologist blamed her and what she looked like and what job she did for why she was raped. And that woman in particular, she did believe that psychologist, because that psychologist was important to her and was authoritative. And so she cut her hair really short, she dyed it black, she covered her body, she wore baggy clothes all the time, she quit her job, she never danced again. And it had a massive impact on her life, because she truly did, for a time, not now, but for a time, believed that those were the things that caused that rape. And so she believed by changing those things, then it won't happen to her again. I also worked with another woman who was being told that the reason she was abused as a child was because she hugged everybody. And she, in her words, she says, I'm a very huggy person. I hug people when I see them. I hug people to say goodbye. I hug my friends. I hug my family. And somebody had commented that that was the reason that she was sexually abused as a child, was because she hugged everybody. She gave off the wrong message. And even for her, that had a big impact on her life, because she started to feel guilty about hugging people, and she started to question whether hugging people was causing people to treat her in an abusive way. And she didn't fully believe it, which was interesting. So when I was talking to her about it, she would say, you know, oh, they said it was this, they said it was because I would hug people, but, you know, and I do hug people, and maybe it is that I do hug people too much, but I don't think it is. And so she was like challenging it, she was questioning it, which is exactly what we need to be doing with our self-blame, is not allow it to become this narrative in our head that constantly says, you know, well, the reason it happened to you is because you did this, it's because you didn't do that, it's because you make bad choices. Is to challenge it back. Is it really that? Or is it because an offender chose to target victims, and unfortunately we were one of those victims? Is that it? You know, some of it is as simple as that. We know that the majority of offenders that commit sexual and domestic offences, you are not the only one they've done that to. It is, especially with child sex offences, those are not one-off offences. These are not the types of people that harm one child and never do it again. It's very, very rare as an offending type. So this isn't actually about you. It's not about the fact you were vulnerable, or that you behaved in a certain way, or that you give off some sort of vibe. It's actually about what the offender gets out of targeting all these different types of victims and all these people in their life. Like, what is the offender getting out of this? And that's how we target and change our self-blame thoughts, is actually push it back on the offender. Think about, you know, blaming the perpetrator. Don't blame yourself. Don't blame the situation you were in. Blame the offender 100%. It was their choice. It was a decision that they took every time, and they wanted to do it because of their selfish aims, that they wanted to harm somebody else. So actually this isn't about us. And once it stops being about us, then self-blame and victim blaming is impossible, because it's actually about perpetrator blaming. Blame the perpetrator. And I guess the issue with that, the only issue I found with that, is that it can sometimes cause a lot of anger. But again, I've said in the other videos, anger is healthy. So if you find that when you start to reprocess your self-blame, you actually get more and more angry at the perpetrator, or more and more angry at whoever covered it up or lied to you or didn't believe you, that's okay. That's just that next stage, is that, you know, once you stop blaming yourself and actually you realise that there was nothing you could have done, that someone chose to target and harm you, it is natural for you then to shift your anger towards them, and that's okay.